when I started doing edited videos under the For Real News tagline, most of the networks I had in mind were really on the fringe far left, more people that are clear about their socialist and communalist, communist leanings. But I do have to sometimes throw in some sources that are considered closer to the mainstream or closer to conventional liberalism that just seem to be completely off their rockers. And you're about to see the public exposition of Rob Reiner, a director, actor. I think he was a meathead from the All in the Family show. And he founded the Committee to Investigate Russia, which is a group which has, I think kind of a Hollywood membership of limited members. And their main message is to continue to propagate the idea that the 2016 election was manipulated by and skewed through Russian interference. And unfortunately, they have not found very fruitful territory in the, even within the the mainstream liberal community, because their releases just seem to be more and more the product of people who they believe that the country has literally fallen under Russian control. So it surprised me when I saw their two guests for a video that was 22 minutes long concerning the Russian interference in the 2016 election, according to them and their acolytes.
Either person can sit at either place.
Either place?
Whatever's good for you.
I don't think either one of us has a good side.
You don't
so
have a good side, it doesn't
We're
matter.
both bad sides.
All right, me too. We're both of the follically challenged. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And the thing that to me is so frustrating is that this cataclysmic thing happened to our country, and people don't seem to understand it, understand the gravity of it. And you guys were talking about how, it's unusual for people who have been. How many years of experience do you have between you, would you say?
Well, Jim has several hundred, I think.
Probably 80 or 90 between the two of us.
So here you are with all that experience. Have you ever seen anything like this happen in this country? I mean, anything like this kind of attack on our political system?
Well,
so you have Reiner, he's the guy with the beard, and he's sitting down and he's hosting two guests in this ornate ballroom of some sort, or some sort of, it looks almost like the halls of a hallowed palace or something. I don't know, I'm getting poetic. And who are these two people? Well, one of them is James Clapper, and it says former director of national intelligence. He oversees all of the intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. And the second person is John Brennan, who is the former director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA. So you have, in one scene, you have two people in charge of the largest spy agencies in America. Well, the NSA is the largest, but you get the point. Two very senior spooks of the Obama administration. And you have a Hollywood director, a major Democratic donor, who has for years been very vocal in his politics. And his job is to direct Hollywood films, essentially to make up stories out of nothing, to be a liar. So you have a professional artistic liar working with a professional real-world liar, two of them actually. That's pretty much the scene that we have here.
In this country, I mean, anything like this kind of attack on our political system?
Well, no, not at least to me, as disturbing as this. I mean, I'm a Vietnam War veteran. I went through all the stresses that in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, but I never felt even then that our fundamental institutions were jeopardized. In fact, our fundamental institutions proved themselves resilient then. And we actually came out of all that a better country. And hopefully we'll have the same experience now.
James Clapper describes his military career in Vietnam and compares it to the current crisis that him, Brennan, and Reiner are highlighting, known as Russiagate. Let's not minimize the fact that Clapper did indeed serve in Vietnam. In fact, let's magnify it. James Clapper served in the Marine Corps Reserve in the early 1960s for a short period, before transferring to Air Force ROTC's program while studying at the University of Maryland. In 1965 and 66, he served one tour at the massive Tan Son Nhut military base in South Vietnam. He then worked in signals intelligence stationed not in Vietnam but in the satellite intelligence posting in an Air Force listening post in Thailand from 1970 to 71 on his next overseas tour. From 1971 to 73, Clapper served as a military assistant to the director of the National Security Agency. So while Clapper is a Vietnam veteran, he neglects to mention that he was involved in the intelligence efforts in Vietnam, of which much scandal resulted, including the Pentagon Papers, of which the mainstream media is now gushing about, since the production of the blockbuster star-studded film, The Post. From there, Clapper progressed to being a senior aide and intelligence officer at Andrews Air Force Base, and rose through the ranks of the U.S. Pacific Command while picking up degrees from the Air Force Staff College and National Defense University. From 1979 through 1981, he served in various Air Force roles at Fort Meade in Maryland, which also happens to be the headquarters of his previous assignment, the NSA. He would then serve executive intelligence roles for the U.S. military forces in Korea, and then as the Director of Intelligence for U.S. Pacific Command, Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for Strategic Air Command, and finally as Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence for the U.S. Air Force Headquarters in Washington, D.C. In November 1991, Clapper was appointed Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which combines the intelligence services of all three branches of the U.S. military. Clapper's biography boasts of 700 flight hours as an Air Force serviceman, but this is typical of someone who flew on surveillance aircraft in the Vietnam era, and in fact Air Force pilots average 150 flight hours per year today. So Clapper's so-called combat experience is limited to 2 tours of Vietnam and in a surveillance capacity. When your mission is to patrol the air while eavesdropping on people on the ground, you end up logging a good amount of flight time. And that's the important point here. Whereas he is quick to highlight his Vietnam War service, Clapper forgets to mention that his entire career from 1965, including that period, was oriented toward work concerning electronic and signals intelligence, known as SIGINT. In other words, he is a 50-year-old eavesdropping veteran. Keep this in mind for the rest of the video, that a person whose entire career was spent gathering and recording communications cannot point to any piece of such evidence that documents the threat he is warning about.
To me, it underscores 2 points. One is how determined Mr. Putin is to shape the political landscape, both inside of Russia as well as outside of Russia. Whether it be in Europe or the United States or the Middle East, other places, he seeks ways to manipulate and exploit the environments. But secondly, it really does underscore just how consequential that digital domain is. And as Jim noted, we've seen these things being done by the Russians over the course of many years. But the fact now that this digital environment, this cybersphere, gives the Russian intelligence security services so much more opportunity to manipulate and to exploit. And they took full advantage of that in the 2016 election. That's why we saw things of much greater concern and intensity than we'd ever seen before. And I think Americans really need to understand just how vulnerable we are to exploitation of that environment by malign actors around the globe.
Is it
John Brennan's career biography is much simpler than Clapper's, which could be why he didn't even answer Reiner's question. The question had been whether either of them had seen a threat similar to the recent one in their long career. Brennan's answer pivoted to talking about Vladimir Putin and his nefarious ways, but doesn't go into exactly what the threat is. Instead, he waxes philosophical about the digital sphere. Brennan began to work at the CIA in 1980 as an analyst and continued until 2005 with assignments including being agency station chief in Riyadh, the Saudi capital at the time of the now forgotten Cobra Towers bombing that killed 19 U.S. military personnel stationed in Al Khobar on the country's Persian Gulf coast by Al Qaeda. What is crucial for this video is to understand that Brennan's career largely concerned U.S. intelligence operations in the Middle East and Arabic-speaking world, not Russia and Eastern Europe. He's a fluent Arabic speaker. In 2009, he was appointed by President Obama to be his advisor on national security, and in 2013 became the director of the CIA. And while that position undoubtedly dealt with Russia-related material, he seems to delight in giving vague and cryptic answers to any question Reiner poses about Russia.
Something that we did not see happening, that we couldn't foresee. I mean, because we talked about 9/11, the planes hitting a building. It seems like they found a huge seam in the our system.
And this goes back to the Soviet era. There's a long history of them intervening and influencing elections, theirs and other people's. And there's historical records that they've attempted to interfere in virtually all of our national elections since the 60s. But never this aggressive, direct, or multidimensional. And of course, as John indicated, they're taking advantage of a huge enabler, the internet and all the technology that gives you, and the ability to influence opinion. A way they've found to attack us is to undermine our fundamental system.
I don't think that, I mean, from my standpoint, I don't think that we, in all of the technological revolution that we've seen over the years, I don't think we have fully understood the power of what it could do. I mean, we certainly understood spreading information, getting word out, being able to, cross boundaries with information. But I don't think we ever thought, I mean, I don't know if you hadn't thought how it could be weaponized to this extent.
It's pretty funny watching Rob Reiner and John Brennan and James Clapper pretend that suddenly the threat of internet hacking became apparent with the 2016 election, and as if Russia had been the only culprit that ever tried to hack into anything, including an election. Now remember, during the past 8 years of Obama, and even beyond that, during the past 25 years, cybersecurity has been a huge issue. China has tried repeatedly and succeeded repeatedly in hacking the data of many different U.S. government institutions, also private companies like Yahoo. Social Security was hacked by China. There was the famous Sony Pictures hack, which is alleged to have been conducted by North Korea. And suddenly you just hear James Clapper basically saying, well, we knew that Russia had tried to influence foreign elections. They always try to influence foreign elections. Well, as a matter of fact, the United States has tried to influence foreign elections abroad too, including in Russia. It's well documented. I'll have the link up. That Russia had a president election in 1996 that was pretty much manipulated and skewed by the United States under Bill Clinton. So everything he's talking about is largely deflection and projection on the part of James Clapper.
Cross boundaries with information, but I don't think we ever thought, I mean, I don't know if you hadn't thought how it could be weaponized to this extent. I mean, was that something that occurred to you, or did you see that as something?
For me, probably not. That's why when this all began to unfold in 15 and 16, and it was kind of insidious as we became more aware of what they were doing, and then I think in the late summer, early fall of 16, when you really saw the magnitude of what they were doing. And for me, I've seen a lot of bad stuff in my 50 years in intelligence, but nothing, I don't recall anything that gave me viscerally in the pit of my stomach a more uncomfortable, uneasy feeling than when I realized what the Russians were doing.
Now, this is what's so ridiculous about what you just saw and heard. For you to believe what James Clapper just said, you would have to be able to conceive of the fact that the former head of Air Force Signals Intelligence, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, somebody who spent his entire career deciphering communications, digital communications specifically, and all of that jazz, that he could not have thought that a foreign power could try to hack into the U.S. election system or do whatever it is that they're talking about. So that's first of all. Then remember that they're not even mentioning what the crime is. It's like a reverse Voldemort. They're willing to mention Putin's name right and left, but they won't talk about specifically what he did. They won't talk about any proof of what he did. They're just talking about, oh, this pit in my stomach about something that happened. I've never seen anything like this. But you won't even talk about what it is. And that's basically the way that they behave throughout this entire video.
The Russians have conducted active measures for many, many years. And in the physical domain, you have certain indicators and signatures that you can forensically then, connect so that you can trace it back then to the ultimate perpetrator or who directed it. But now, just like with terrorists and organized criminals and others, intelligence services can do things in that cyber domain that they can really camouflage and mask their steps. So I think we always anticipated that the Russians will continue to try to exploit certain situations. But now with this digital environment, it's become much more challenging for intelligence, security, and law enforcement services to understand exactly who is behind some of these activities that really make it very challenging for us to understand who is actually directing these actions.
Okay, if you stuck through that long word salad that John Brennan just said, he's basically saying that, the Russians have been doing this for a long time, and we know that they're very crafty at covering their tracks, but we know it's them, but it's harder than ever because of the internet to actually decide who's doing this and who isn't and who's directing them, and it's a challenge, and we don't know, but we do, but it's Putin, but it's a challenge. That's basically, if you watch that last minute, that's basically his message. And Russia's scary. That's his whole message.
Were there when you saw the initial attack, and you hear this term all the time, collusion, conspiracy, coordination. I mean, these things are thrown around all over the place. But the idea of active measures that the Russians have, trafficked in for forever. What does that look like? I mean, what would, like in a political campaign like this, what does an active measure look like?
Well, I think a lot of times what the Russians, as well as others do, is to either fabricate a story or to take a story that may be patently false, but yet advances one's narrative and argument and push it out and propagate it and lends legitimacy to it. And so it's a way to color people's perceptions and impressions of individuals.
I understand that St. Petersburg is pushing out, trolls and bots and getting, messages out and piggybacking on messages that, the Trump campaign is doing. Is there any granularity to getting into these districts in Wisconsin or Michigan or, did they play on that level?
It appears now that it was pretty sophisticated, and they did focus on certain voter blocks. And of course, 70 or 80,000 votes in 3 states would have swung the election. And apparently, the Russians have gone to school on our system, understand it. We've had very successful campaigns in this country. President Obama, case in point, where they did this micro-analysis on a district by district, precinct by precinct basis.
They would understand that based on just, observing American television, or they need some kind of help through a Cambridge Analytica or people on the ground who have been, assets that have been developed over many years?
That's a good question. They could have, but it's very clear that they understood the dynamic, the political dynamics, political landscape here, and they certainly understood how to use tools to exploit it.
The Russians take full advantage of the openness of our society. They have operated here in the United States for many, many years. So they can have access to experts and others who they try to elicit information from, even those individuals who do not even know that they're interacting or supporting the Russians. So we're looking at the different attack vectors. Information was one of them in terms of what they were pushing out. Collecting information from the internet in terms of the email theft that went on with the DCCC, the DNC. But also we knew from experience that the Russians had many different methods of influencing elections in Europe. Getting politicians to accept money, trying to get push money into political parties, maybe camouflaging the source, and extorting and even blackmailing individuals to work with them. We've seen that across the board, and there's a lot of publicly available information and stories about that.
To try to understand.
Okay, so this whole exchange that we see here, we see Rob Reiner again just freak out and say, well, you guys were there and you saw this threat, and he actually says, you were there and you actually saw the attack. No, they didn't see any attack because there was no attack. Basically, this whole theory relies on the belief that some Facebook ads and some fake news influenced the people of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, and Florida, and North Carolina, and a bunch of other swing states to vote against Hillary Clinton. And a lot of the data that was mined in order to see, oh, who did Russia try to influence? Well, it doesn't show that that had a conclusive effect on the election. The other stuff that he points out is kind of not validated. For example, that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee and the DCCC, which is their congressional wing. That's never been proven. There's been no proof that it was Russia that hacked those institutions. There's inferences, there's stuff that's been said maybe behind closed doors that we're not allowed to know about because it's classified. Apparently, it's been talked about in closed session. So basically, Rob Reiner has these two people here talking about Facebook ads, talking about fake news, and talking about the possibility of closed session briefings to Congress about Russian hacking into the DNC and whatnot, despite the DNC not handing over its servers for inspection by the FBI or any other service. So I really don't see how this person can actually go forward, Rob Reiner, without saying, well, why didn't you do anything? If you saw this happen, he says that they saw the attack happen. By the way, he says that it was coming out of St. Petersburg. In reality, I believe that the capital of Russia is Moscow, and the intelligence services are based out of there, but maybe he knows something I don't know about Russian intelligence. So anyway, this is enough for today. There will be more tomorrow about this bizarre show of three liars, each with his own peculiar style, trying to make the case that we're under Russian occupation. Dobry wieczór, towarzyszy.